We would like to welcome you all to this lecture, which is distinguishing features of international trade. So in our previous lecture, which is basically the basic concepts of international trade, we have explained the definition of international trade. Then we try to we explain why nations trade. We also try to explain the issues related to international trade, such as the theory of absolute advantage, the theory of comparative advantage, and some of the issues such as trade barriers, regulation on trade, globalization. So those issues are already covered in our previous lecture. So in this lecture, which we title as Distinguishing Features of International Trade, we try to explore the features which are more prominent or which are unique in case of international trade. So by saying so, I am not saying that those features are not available in case of interregional trade or trade within countries. But the problem is that in case of trade within countries or regional trade, those features are not so prominent, or intensity of these features are not so severe. So that is why we have to analyze those features in case of international trade separately. Now, what are those features that make international trade as a distinct branch of economics as compared to interregional trade? The first feature is the immobility of factors of production. We all know that generally we have 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. So in case of trade within countries, or in case of regional trade also, the factors of production are not perfectly mobile. But in case of interregional trade, although factors of production are not perfectly mobile, but restrictions are comparatively very less, and as a result, the factors of production can move from one region of a country to another region of a country without giving much effort. But this is not happening in case of international trade. In case of international trade, there are lots of restrictions on movement of factors of production from one country to the other. So those restriction or those immobility of factors of production has an impact on the volume and extent of international trade, as well as it has some consequences. So that is why we need to discuss these features, the immobility of factors of production in international trade, in a separate platform. So that is why it is considered to be a distinct features of international trade, which we will discuss in this lecture. Another important features of international trade, which is very prevalent, that is immobility of products. Although products are comparatively mobile in international trade as compared to factors of production, but in spite of that, lots of restrictions are there on mobility of product from one country to another country. Now, in case of trade within countries or regional trade also, the factors of production are not perfectly mobile. For example, if we consider the case of India, if a particular state want to export a particular commodity from one state to another state, then what happens? There is some kind of restriction in terms of toll gate. They have to pay some kind of taxes to the government. So that is why in case of interregional trade also, restrictions are there, but those restrictions are very minimal, which as a result, to move a product from one state to another state is comparatively easy in case of interregional trade. But in case of international trade, lots of restrictions are there on mobility of products, and that is why we need to study the consequences of immobility of products on international trade in a separate platform. Now, another important feature is heterogeneous market. It is obvious that each country has their own culture, tradition, and own set of regulation regarding the market. And as a result, as compared to trade within countries, in case of international trade, the markets is not homogeneous. They are widely diversified, and the nature of the content of heterogeneity is prevalent or more dominant in case of international trade. So as a result, it is very difficult for the producer of a particular country to prepare a product, to produce a product for international market, as markets in each country are of different types, and that is why we need to have a separate attention on these features, that is heterogeneity of market structure in different countries. Now, another important features of international trade is the differences in currencies. Now, the producers who want to export or import commodities or factors of production from one country to another country, they have to use different kind of currencies. For example, in India, we exchange goods and services in terms of rupee. So in case of Pakistan, it is Pakistani rupee. In case of Bangladesh, it is taka. In case of USA, it is USA dollar. In case of UK, it is pound sterling. And in case of most of the European countries, it is in terms of euro. So as a result, so differences in currencies have an impact on the exchange rate, and ultimately the appreciation and depreciation in the currency has an impact on the exchange rate, and it will make export and import either cheaper or dearer. So as a result, what happened? We need to have a study regarding this issue in case of international trade separately. Now, another important features of international trade is the differences in resource endowment. So it is obvious that each country has their own advantage in different kind of resources. The resource endowment in different countries is different. Some, in some countries, some of the resources are very abundant as compared to other countries, and in some countries, some of the resources are scarce. So as a result, we need to have an exchange between those countries so that we have a balance in the resource endowment. So in case of international trade, since the differences in resource endowment is quite large, so that is why we need to discuss this in this lecture. We also observed that each country has their own national policies and government intervention. So those national policies and government intervention has an impact on the volume and extent of international trade. For example, the countries of different regions, they impose different kind of restrictions such as trade and non-trade barriers, different regulations. So ones who want to trade in international arena, they have to abide by those national policy and government intervention, and that is why it is considered to be an important features of international trade. So another important features of international trade is the transport and insurance cost. So transport. So why we need to discuss this differently? Because the amount of transport and insurance cost in case of international trade is quite huge. So it's a huge challenge for the producer. So that is why we need to have discuss this issue. So that is why we have included these features in this lecture. Next, another important features is the problem of balance of payment. So balance of payment, in general language, it is basically the total export and import of a country within a specified period of time. Now, change in exchange rate, change in interest rate, change in inflation, so those are some of the economic variables which has an impact on balance of payment. Balance of payment has an impact on the volume of international trade. So that is why we have included these features in this lecture to have an idea regarding the problem, how the problem of balance of payment create issues related to international trade. Another important feature is different economic environment. So we know that within a country, it generally happens that an economic environment are more or less similar. But in case of international trade, the economic environment is quite diversified and heterogeneous, which necessitate to study this problem separately in international trade. Another important issue is the socio-political condition, which has an impact, although it is not economic, but socio-political condition also have an impact on international trade, and that is why we need to these socio-political conditions as a special feature of international trade. So now we will start with immobility of factors. Now, what immobility of factors refers to? Immobility of factors in international trade refers to inability or difficulty of the production factors, as I have already mentioned, such as labor, capital and land, to move freely across borders. So it generally happens that in contrast to goods and services that can be traded relatively easily between countries, factors of production often face significant barriers to international movement. So that is why this concept of immobility of factors is crucial to understanding the dynamics of global trade and economic theory. Now, when we are talking about factors of production, the most important factors of production is labor. Now, the first and the foremost barrier is the language differences. I am not saying that that differences is not prevalent in inter-regional trade. In inter-regional trade also, language barriers are always there. For example, in country with multilingual states, we have also language differences, but we have some common languages or national recognized language through which you can communicate with each other. But in case of international trade, the problem of language differences create a huge problem, and as a result, labor cannot move from one country to another country. Even they have the required amount of skill set. In spite of that, they cannot move from one country to another country, and they cannot involve in the production activities of other countries because of the language barriers, because they cannot communicate. They cannot communicate with others. So another important barrier is immigration laws. So immigration laws are different for different countries. So it creates problem for the labor to move from one country to another country. So as I have already discussed, the cultural differences. Even inter-regional trade also, in a country like India, we have huge differences in culture in terms of kind of dress, kind of language, kind of ethnicity. So according to that, we have defined cultural differences. But those kind of cultural differences is quite huge in case of international trade that act as a barrier for movement of labor from one country to another country. Another important barrier is professional certification. This is basically applied in case of educated laborers. So they may have acquired some kind of skill which is required to do some kind of job. But the problem is that they need to have some kind of certification from the country where they want to migrate. But that particular country may have their own rule regarding the certification. So that act as a barrier for mobility of laborers from one country to another country because of varying professional certification, which prevent workers from moving freely between countries. Now, since we have already discussed about the barriers, so what is the impact of factor immobility on international trade? Now, what happened? Factor immobility basically leads to wage disparities between countries. So obviously, for instance, skilled workers may be surplus in one country while being scarce in another, but they cannot easily migrate to balance these differences, which create disparities in wages. Now, since we are talking about immobility of factors of production, so capital is another important factor which is also not mobile in case of international trade. But while financial capital, that is investment, can move more freely than labor, but it still faces restrictions such as regulation, taxation policies, exchange rate risk, and political instability. Now, what happens when factors of production are not mobile? So, it has an impact. So, what kind of impact we have to discuss? For example, if you see factors of production basically in case of fixed capital. So, whenever we are talking about fixed capital, we can give the example of machineries and factories. So in case of those fixed capital like machinery and factory, they are less mobile because it is they are physically tied to a specific location. So making them difficult to shift from one production facilities to other production facilities, or you can say from one countries to another countries. Now another important factors of production is land and natural resources. So it is easily understandable that so land cannot be moved from one country to another country. So this is applicable in case of regional trade also. Land cannot be transferred from one state to other. But the problem is that in case of regional trade, the restrictions are comparatively less, and as a result, a producer in one state can take the land or use the land of another land from another states for production activities without having much difficulty. But in case of international trade, it is not the case because land is inherently mobile since it cannot be moved. So that is why access to these natural resources, that is land, which is geographically determined and often controlled by national policies and regulation, it is not obviously mobile. But we need to have a study whether does it have an impact on international trade. The impact is that differences in access to natural resources affect countries' comparative advantages, so which ultimately influence their participation in international trade. Now, we'll try to answer the question why immobility of factors matters in trade theory. Because that is why we need to have a separate set of theory in case of international trade. So we'll just try to give the gist of that fact in this lecture. We have observed that in classical and neoclassical economic theories, particularly in the Hexer-Ohlin model, factors of production are assumed to be immobile internationally. Now, since factors of production are immobile internationally, the Hexer and Ohlin model suggests that countries will specialize in producing goods that require factors that have in abundance, so leading to efficient global resource allocation. Now, problem is that if factors were mobile, if we assume that factors were mobile, so what will happen? The benefit of comparative advantage would diminish as factors would flow to location with the highest return, and as a result reducing the need for trade. So that is why immobility of factors of production in trade theory is a matter to discuss in detail. Now we will try to see what are the consequences of factor immobilities. The first consequences is I have already mentioned the wage and income disparities. So obviously immobility leads to differences in wages and capital returns between countries. For example, what happens? Workers in high income countries can earn more than those in low income countries even they have the similar skill. Now if you consider underdeveloped countries such as India and a developed countries such as USA or European countries, now there is always a possibility that now workers in India have the similar skill with that of the workers in developed countries, but the amount of wages they earn in India is much low as compared to other developed countries. This is because of immobility of factors which create huge wage and income disparities between countries. Another important consequences is inefficient allocation of resources. Why it is happening? Because without the ability to reallocate labor or capital to where it is needed, economies may experience inefficiencies as well as lower productivity and reduce economic growth. So that is another consequences of factor immobility, because it creates inefficient allocation of resources. Another important consequences is increased trade and outsourcing. So what happened? Due to factor immobility, countries engage in international trade to access goods and services they cannot efficiently produce themselves. So this also leads to outsourcing of production to countries with cheaper labor or specialized resources. So one of the most important consequences of factor immobility is the political and social implications. So what happens? As a result of restriction on labor mobility, it can exacerbate the social inequality or increase the social inequality and lead to political tension, especially in regions with higher unemployment or underemployment. Now, since we have discussed about factors immobility, now we will try to understand what product immobility and how product immobility can impact international trade. Now, product immobility occurs when physical, regulatory or market factors restrict the movement of goods from one location to another. So in case of interregional trade also, product immobility is there, but the restriction in terms of physical, regulatory and market is comparatively very less or non-existent. But this is not happening in case of international trade. Now, unlike services or digital product which can be delivered instantaneously, so physical goods often fail logistic, legal and infrastructural challenges that make their transfers across border very difficult. Now, it has an impact on international trade because it increases cost as well as reduce profit margin. Now, immobility increases the cost of transportation of product, warehousing and compliance with regulation. So these additional expenses can erode profit margin, especially it affects the small and medium sized enterprises looking to expand internationally. The another impact of product immobility is the limited market access. It generally happens that companies may struggle to enter new market due to the logistical and regulatory barriers associated with product immobility. So this can limit growth opportunities and it also restrict access to global consumer bases. So another important impact of product immobility which we need to discuss in detail is the supply chain vulnerabilities. So what happens due to immobility of product, so due to inability to move goods efficiently from one country to another country, it can disrupt the global supply chain, particularly for companies reliant on just-in-time inventory system. So delays in product mobility can lead to stock out, lost sales and customers dissatisfaction, and it will ultimately create the problem of vulnerabilities in global supply chain. Another important impact of product immobility is the reduced competitive advantage. So businesses that cannot overcome product immobility may lose out to competitors that have more efficient logistics, better regulatory knowledge and stronger local partnership. Another important features of international trade is heterogeneous market. So what happened in the global business landscape? Markets are rarely uniform. It is not possible that markets are uniform in case of each country. Even in interregional trade also markets are not uniform. But in the extent of uniformity, by extent of heterogeneity in case of interregional trade is not much as compared to interregional trade. So as a result, instead of homogeneity, in case of international trade, they vary significantly across different countries and regions. So this variation is referred to as market heterogeneity. So understanding heterogeneity market is crucial for companies engaged in international trade because it involves recognizing the differences in consumer preferences, cultural norms, economic condition, regulatory environment, and competitive landscape across the world. Now, what happened? What kind of challenges due to heterogeneous market for it pose for international trade? The first challenges is adapting market strategies. How to adapt the market? Now, companies need to localize how they can adapt the challenge. What companies have to do? Companies need to localize their marketing messages to resonate with diverse audience. So that is why one size fits all approach may not work in market with different languages, culture, and consumer behaviors. Another important challenge is the product customization. How do they customize their product? So what the companies will do, what the businessmen will do, businesses may need to modify their product, or businessmen have to, or producer has to modify their product to meet local taste, regulatory standard, or climate condition. For example, if we give the example of McDonald's, McDonald's is a global fast food chain. What they do, McDonald's offer region-specific menu. For example, such as vegetarian option in India. Another important challenge is the pricing strategies. So the price policy or pricing must reflect the economic condition and consumer purchasing power, because countries can be categorized into different categories on the basis of the purchasing power, on the basis of the per capita income. So the countries where the per capita income is comparatively less, companies have to adopt different kind of price strategies. So as a result, in market with lower income level, or in a countries with lower income level, companies may need to adopt value-based pricing or introduce small package sizes to make the product more affordable for those people. That is another important challenge. Next, obviously, when market is heterogeneous, it again creates the supply chain complexity. So operating in heterogeneous market requires complex supply chains that can be handled variation in demand, regulatory requirement, and distribution challenges. Now companies have to ensure those challenges, because ensuring consistent product quality while adapting to local preferences is another layer of complexity for the companies involved in international trade. Now, after discussing about the features of heterogeneity, we will try to discuss differences in currency. Currency differences play a crucial role in international trade, because each country in international trade have different sets of currencies. As I have already mentioned, in India rupee is acceptable, but it is not acceptable in other countries such as South Asian countries or European countries or American countries, whatever it may be. So as a result, as international trade happens in terms of different currencies, we need to have an exchange rate between the currencies so that goods can be imported and exported. So that is why differences in currencies is considered another important features of international trade. It has an impact on exchange rate. Now the exchange rate, which is the value of one currency in relation to other, affect the prices of goods and services traded across borders. So as a result, this fluctuation can have a significant impact on the profitability, competitiveness, and decision making of business engaged in global trade. Now, what are the key ways currency differences influence international trade? Currency differences influences international trade in terms of exchange rate fluctuation, impact on price and profitability, impact on investment and economic stability, hedging and financial instrument, and balance of trade, etc. Now, another important challenge or important features of international trade is the differences in resource endowment. Obviously, in each country has different sets of resources. One particular resource may be abundant in one country, which is scarce in another country. So, as a result, in international economics, the concept of resource endowment is very important. Now, what is resource endowment? What does it refer? The resource endowment basically refers to the natural resources, labor, capital, and technological capabilities that countries possesses. So, these differences in resource availability significantly influence the pattern of international trade, specialization, and economic growth. Now, we have to understand the differences of resource endowment with reference to international trade, because understanding how variation in resource endowment shape economic activity and trade flows is very essential for understanding fundamental of global economics. So we can give some example of differences in resource endowment in international trade. For example, we can give the example of Brazil agricultural export. So we know that Brazil is a leading exporter of soybean, coffee, and sugar due to its fertile land and favorable climate. So what happened as a result? Brazil leverages its natural endowment in agriculture to dominate the global market. Similarly, you can give the example of China's manufacturing boom. So China's abundant labor force combined with investment in infrastructure and technology has allowed it to become a manufacturing powerhouse, exporting electronics, machinery, and consumer goods worldwide. Similarly, we can give the example of Botswana diamond industry. So Botswana has successfully capitalized on its diamond resources to achieve significant economic growth. However, it has also worked to, but however, every country has to work to diversify its economy to reduce dependence on single resource. Now, another important features of international trade is that different national policies and government intervention. Each country has their own set of priorities, own set of policies, own set of government intervention. Now, those policies has to be discussed in detail in case of international trade, so that we have an idea about the nature, volume, and extent of international trade. It generally happens that international trade is significantly influenced by the different policies and intervention of different countries. Basically, that is why while free trade advocates or argue for minimal government interference to enhance efficiency and economic growth. But the problem is that although we are talking about free trade in the era of globalization, in reality, most governments regulate trade to protect domestic industries, promote economic development, and achieve political objectives. So this intervention can take various forms, including tariff, subsidies, quotas, trade agreement, and regulatory measures. So we have to understand those policies, we have to understand those government intervention and impact of those policies and government intervention on international trade. Because understanding how different national policies impact international trade is essential for businesses, policymakers, and economics navigating the global marketplace. Transport and insurance costs are also considered to be an important features of international trade. Now, I am not saying that transport and insurance cost is not there in case of international trade, but the magnitude or the extent of cost in terms of transport and insurance in case of international trade is quite huge, which necessitates a separate study in case of international trade. Because transport and insurance costs are crucial factors, it influences the flow of international trade. While trade policies and tariff often receive significant attention, the costs associated with moving goods across border and protecting them against risks can be equally important. So these costs affect the overall competitiveness of export and import, impacting the pricing, market access and profitability. So that is why understanding how transport and insurance costs shape international trade is vital for business, policymakers and economics looking to optimize global supply chains. Now, after discussing the issue of transport and insurance, we will discuss the problem of balance of payment in reference to international trade. Balance of payment is a comprehensive record of a country's economic transaction with the rest of the world over a specified period, usually a year. It includes all trade in goods and services, financial transfers, and investment between the residents of the country and global economy. While balance of payment faces issues such as persistent deficit or surplus, it can significantly impact international trade, exchange rate, and overall economic stability. So that is why we need to address the issue of balance of payment in case of international trade, and that is why it is considered to be important features of international trade. In case of international trade, again it happens that each country has their own economic environment, and since international trade occurs within diverse global landscape where each country operates under its unique and economic environment. So that is why different economic environment is the issue of concern for international trade. Now, the term economic environment, it basically encompasses the various factors, including economic system, policies, market structure, levels of development, and regulatory framework. So these differences can significantly impact how countries engage in trade, the nature of goods and services exchange, and the overall flow of investment. So understanding how different economic environment affect international trade is necessary for businesses, policymakers, and economics to navigating the global market effectively. The last important features which we will discuss in this lecture is socio-political condition. Although this is not an economic issue, but it also has an impact on international trade, and that is why it is considered to be an important feature of international trade. International trade is not solely governed by economic principle. It is also profoundly influenced by the socio-political condition of the countries. The socio-political condition, it includes the factors like political instability, social norms, cultural values, government policies, and overall economic structure. So these factors can either facilitate or it can hinder trade relation between countries, affecting everything from the ease of doing business to the flow of goods, services, and investment. So that is why we need to understand the impact of socio-political condition on international trade. So understanding how socio-political condition influence international trade is crucial for businesses, policymakers, and economics in aiming to study the complexities of the global market. So these are the important features of international trade. So thus, in conclusion, what we can say, international trade is influenced by a variety of factors, as we have already discussed, such as immobility of factors of production, immobility of product, heterogeneous market, currency differences in resource environment, national policies in government intervention, transportation and insurance costs, balance of payment, etc. So while these factors also impact the inter-regional trade, their effects are significantly more intense in context of international trade, which requires a focused approach. So that is why we need to study the reasons for international trade as a separate discipline or separate course, whatever it may be, and those kind of so this complexity necessitates specialized theories to address the unique challenges of global trade. So that is why we need to discuss whether we need a separate set of theories to deal with international trade, which we will discuss in our next lecture. Thank you.